So welcome everybody. Our special guest for today's talk is Jill Jarvis, who is an assistant professor in the Department of French and a member of the Councils on African Studies and Middle East Studies at Yale. Her book, Decolonizing Memory, Algeria and the Politics of Testimony, was published by Duke University Press in 2021. Her current project, Signs in the Desert, Aesthetic Cartographies of the Sahara, builds a case for how contemporary writers and filmmakers from across the African Sahara transform the reductive ways in which this desert has long been mapped. She's also a founding member of the Desert Futures Collective, an interdisciplinary research collaboration. Jill, welcome to afikra.
Thank you, Mikey. Thanks for having me here. This is really great. And
I'm really excited
for all of your thoughtful questions already.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. So I guess the most obvious place to start is, why Algeria?
That's a great question I often get asked.
Yeah.
Give me just a moment. There's something with my screen. Well, there are both personal and intellectual reasons for why Algeria. I think it started with reading, actually, long before I even decided to do a PhD. I had a mentor and a friend who sort of encouraged me, or put the book L'amour la fantasia by Assia Djebar, Love, an Algerian sort of cavalcade is how it's been translated. Because I had just sort of long-standing interests in colonial violence. This is when I was about in my mid-20s, and I had studied abroad actually in Sri Lanka. I had spent a number of years actually really trying to think through the implications of colonial violence in South Asia. And then I sort of just encountered this text because my mentor discovered that I had sort of latent French and said, well, you should sort of, I mean, this writer's amazing for thinking through issues of colonial violence in Algeria, about which I knew so little. I've literally very little about Algeria, like many Americans, I think, people educated in the US, unlike people educated, say, in France or even in Europe, just have a very dim sense of Algerian history or North African history. And she put this, her name is Bella Brodsky. She's a professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College. And she put this book in my hands and was just like, go with it. And I found it incredibly opaque and difficult and challenging. And my French wasn't even sort of good enough to get a handle on even a paragraph, but there was something about it that spoke to me, that resonated. And so I pored over that text and became enamored in some sense of Djebar's language. I don't know if you know her work. She's perhaps one of the most well-known of Algerian writers. She died a few years ago, and is this incredible oeuvre that really grapples with the complexity of sort of the afterlives of colonial violence in Algeria and the sort of linguistic and sort of other sorts of social complexity in Algeria. And so I don't know, I like difficulty, I think, and I responded to this text, and that's where it started, quite frankly. I wanted to start translating it to understand it better. I began to read other works by Assia Djebar, and this was corresponding to the sort of the years just after 9/11 as well. And I was interested in studying Arabic, and a number of different interests just sort of coalesced and actually started to catch fire with reading Assia Djebar's work. And that's where I decided to get a PhD, study Arabic, and eventually through the course of actually getting the PhD, it took me a couple of years to figure out how to get to Algeria, because it's rather complicated. So in the years post 1990s, the Algerian Civil War, traveling to Algeria, I think in the early 2000s and even the 2010s was just rather complicated. It took contact with a research institute. It took sort of months to figure out how to get a visa. So I spent a few years actually studying Arabic in Morocco and undertaking my PhD and figuring out how to get to Algeria. And so I first went to Algeria in 2013, right as I was starting my dissertation. And it was almost like, it sort of slowly dawned on me that so many of the works I had read, so many things actually led back to Algeria. Derrida, Camus, reading high school, sort of the stranger translation. I just remember the sort of dawning realization that I had been taught Camus and The Stranger with no mention of the colonial context that was actually set in Algeria, right? So there was just kind of this dawning awareness that the French occupation of Algeria had such a profound and transformative effect on literary production, on philosophical production, on history that I had not been taught about.
Sure.
And so it just dawned on me through reading, and then I found my way step by step.
Yeah.
And
So
there
Algeria was a big part of your life before you even knew it.
Exactly. And it just sort of unveiled itself in some way through reading. And then once I actually went there in 2013, it was just so incredibly intellectually engaging and emotionally engaging on a number of levels. So I mean, we can talk about that. That's where the dissertation starts. But
yeah. So let's talk about the book that came out of that dissertation, Decolonizing Memory, Algeria and the Politics of Testimony. And I like thinking about the structure of books before we actually get to it. So this, from what I understand, this book sort of was born out of an essay that turned into some broader idea. How did you choose the sort of dotted line around the book's scope?
That is a good question. When I look at this book, it's such an interesting process now to look back at the book and to talk about it, because it's almost like I look at these chapters and it's this deep archaeology of 10 years of a process of figuring this out. So I said 2013, that's when I first went to Algeria, but the seed of this project had already been sort of started to sprout, as it were, when I was writing about and thinking about Agamben's treatment of the term Musulman, which we can talk about, which is actually the focus of chapter 1. Right, so I had already been thinking about theories of testimony, acts of testimony in the wake of extraordinary violence like the Holocaust through a number of different works. And then I had also been reading a lot of works that were really grounded in the colonial occupation and situation and afterlife of colonial violence in Algeria. So those, and thinking about what kinds of works were foregrounded in the scholarship I was reading. So there was a sort of a décalage, as it were, and just like theories of testimony, memory, trauma, and the kinds of works I was reading. So I showed up in Algeria with a number of questions sort of rolling around, and I did not plan out this structure. I did not plan out in advance actually which writers were going to speak to these questions, but over the process of doing the dissertation, I encountered works actually, and it was really through so I showed up in Algiers in 2013. I had just had a brief encounter with a text by Yamina Meshakra, whose work is at the focus of chapter 2. And so while I was there, I talked to people who had known her. I read more deeply her works, and I just began to sort of read differently because I was there, first of all, about the ways in which her novel, she only has 2 actually, but the first novel, La Grotte Éclatée, the way in which it was really deeply thinking through how do you give form to the kinds of testimonies, voices, experiences of the anti-colonial war and its aftermath that don't find space in the national narrative of independence and revolution, right? So I was able to start thinking about that. So basically, the book emerged as a series of close readings and sort of the contact of true curiosity and almost love for the texts that I was reading that were grappling with issues of testimony, which is to say, who can bear witness to history and how and in what form, and what frames exist for certain voices to be heard or not heard, right? So it was a very organic process is what I'm saying. And each chapter sort of wrestles with a different problem, a connected problem of testimony over a kind of long chronological arc.
Cool.
So that's, I don't know about it. There was no real borderline.
No, that helps. Yeah. So I want to pull out one of the sort of quotes, because I think it gives an interesting sort of entry point into the thesis of the book. I'll read it for those who can't see the screen. You say, above all, decolonizing memory is a defense of literature's unexpected, disruptive, and surreptitious power to make ghosts perceptible and to make possible what state violence has rendered nearly unimaginable. So I want to ask about one word. I told you this before we started the call. The word defense. It seems, I'm curious, who are you defending this to, and who sort of is pushing back against this, if anyone? And like literature's role, is that sort of underrated? Did you underrate its unexpected, disruptive, and surreptitious power? Why is its power so unexpected? And what did you sort of discover in putting this book together?
That is such a good question. I think, I mean, it's a book that really reads history through the prism of literature, that reads political questions through the prism of literature, which means it's like that in the act of close reading and writing and sort of working through literature, there's a kind of imaginative training that is possible. And that literature kind of does history and memory in these particular kinds of ways, in the sense that I think, like Assia Djebar's works, for instance, and this is what helps me to think about it, try to think with and find ways to move in the archival gaps and absences, the kinds of material that does not show up in the archive, the kinds of voices that get written violently out of the archive. And literature has a particular way of sort of moving into archival silences and gaps, and creating forms to attune our senses differently to perceive what we otherwise couldn't perceive, right? And so I think that is more than just sort of an interesting quality of literature. I think it can actually transform the ways that we think about what matters. And that's the inherently political sort of problem, right? Like, what matters, what counts. So in terms of defense, it might sound a bit more combative than I mean it, but I do work, I'm a really interdisciplinary kind of thinker. I come from a comparative literature department, and I'm now working in a French department, but as you mentioned, I'm sort of part of all of these different area studies spaces. And there is a kind of, a way that especially literary works from the global South can be treated as sort of case studies or examples of, or like, I don't know, case studies of political processes or historical processes. And I think that there's actually something more going on with literary works. And so I just consistently foreground in all of my work, in all of the way I teach, the way I think, the way I write, close reading, close and I think that has a transformative capacity. That's the point.
I guess what I was trying to get at slightly is, it's in contrast, literature's role is in contrast to some of the other sort of texts that people look to understand the war, right? And understand life and sort of, and remember life. And I think you used literature as a way to sort of, as you say, foreground it, versus some of the other historical texts and things that people use to imagine that history. Am I right about that, or am I wrong about that? Am I misunderstanding?
That sounds true. That sounds true. And I think, and I look at like literary works, they're not just documents of past events, or they're just not just like filling in what's missing from history, but they're sort of these open-ended, restless ways of trying to articulate other kinds of truth, trying to find forms to articulate other kinds of imagination, and also, really importantly, hold open space for mourning and grief and unsettlement. So I think there's an actual kind of verbal doing of literature that's in the act of reading, writing, translating, exchanging, closely sort of interacting, that has a transformative effect on the imagination that interests me. So
I want to ask you a couple other questions so explain to our listeners and viewers what the term Anarchive is, and why it's a useful sort of concept for you to not necessarily introduce, but to present in the book.
And you've got, I've picked this term up from my colleague and friend Leah Brosgal, and she thinks with it in a really particular circumstance, which is what this book you've got up is about, which I read an essay that sort of became this book, and then recently read this book and have learned a lot from it. But she's thinking about, so in October 1961, in sort of the last year of the Algerian War for Independence, the French police attacked and killed peaceful Algerian protesters in Paris in this event that's often called 17th of October 1961. And the actual police archives were shut until the 1990s. I mean, there was like really no, and I mean, the history of archives in France is also a particular kind of problem. There's like a certain kind of state control over and fetishization of the official archives in France, right? And so those were closed, like actually closed and not accessible for the, decades after that event. And so she's really thinking through this situation in which an incredible act, like the most violent act of police brutality in Europe, took place, but there were no sort of official acknowledgements or records of it. So what she does is excavate and think through and read all of these other cultural traces, right? Songs, poems, literature that actually constructs a counter archive. But the term anarchive, I think she takes it from Derrida, but it's this interesting sort of tension where there's this whole incredible body of material that actually creates the possibility for memory and creates the possibility for history of this event in the absence of an archive, in tension with an official archive. So I find the term and that idea really enabling to think about what it is that literary and aesthetic works do, right? They actually have a kind of a direct impact on what becomes history, right? Or what can become history and memory. And so that term sort of activated my thinking. There are others, there's like an Anarchiving collective and others who've been thinking about it. I have a friend, Rahim Al-Gabli, who's thinking about something called other archives in the context of the Moroccan Years of Lead. And so in which like the open secret of basically death prisons has been registered, documented, challenged through aesthetic works, right? So those ideas I think are incredibly powerful and ways that have sort of informed the way I think about what literary works, and not just literary works. When I say literature, I mean it kind of broadly, all kinds of aesthetic works, because I'm really interested in film and photographs and other kinds of works that actually creates the possibility for writing history in the future in the absence of archives. And actually, I think there's something very important about works that exist outside the aegis of state power. Right. So the kinds of evidence that sort of national archives document, or even the kinds of evidence that historiographers rely on to write their histories, they tend to fall under the power of the state or the government. And so I think this move, and hence the term, anarchy sort of embedded in it, I think is enabling. Yeah. I hope that.
Yeah. That totally
also
that totally makes sense. I'm going to jump around a little bit because you alluded to this earlier, but I'd love for you to tell a little bit of the history behind the term Musalman.
Yes,
it's a complicated story, but you are positioned well to try to shed some light on it.
It is a complicated story that I spent years sort of puzzling through. So, and what I'm saying, it's in the book, I've got an essay called Remnants of Muslims that's actually kind of puts a point on this, right? But when I was in grad school, somebody, actually the translator of Agamben was a professor in my department. So I sort of encountered this book, Remnants of Auschwitz by Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, so who's sort of well known for thinking about bare life and sort of what happens to humans who are subjected to the intense violent power of the law and the state. And in this book called Remnants of Auschwitz, what Agamben is doing is like trying to think through the paradox of testimony, as he puts it, after Auschwitz, right? So, and he does this by focusing on this figure in the camp, this horrific sort of like in the brutal and grotesque hierarchy of Auschwitz and then the death camps, the people who were the most destroyed by that horrific experience were referred to by fellow inmates and others in the camps as Musulmaner, this term here, right? And Agamben picks this up. I think you might have an image on one of the other slides.
I do,
The
yeah. I should.
by,
I just want to warn. There's like it's quite graphic, so anyone who's a
you
little.
can just briefly,
Yeah.
because Agamben takes this up. This Aldo Carpi was an inmate at one of the camps, and drew this sort of representation of what a Musulmaner in the camp would look like. And Agamben takes this up and really thinks through. We don't have to leave the image up there.
Yeah, I'll put it back up.
But so in this book, sorry, I'm thinking through.
No, keep going. Yeah.
So he takes this figure, the Musulman, in Auschwitz in particular, and starts to think with it. So there's a whole chapter in that book about the Musulman, and what he's trying to think through is the paradox of testimony after such extreme violence, right? The point being that those who've actually witnessed the true horror of the Shoah are the ones who aren't here to narrate it, the ones who've been so destroyed. And so he sort of develops this theory of thinking through testimony in that book, right? But I was so troubled because I was reading this book in graduate school. At the same time, I was reading all of this work from Algeria, right? And then really thinking through, I mean, Algeria under 130 years of French occupation was this ground zero of a uniquely strange juridical regime that was founded on this legal distinction drawn between French citizens and this ghostly non-citizen subject that was called either Musulman subject or Israelite subject, right? But the category Musulman in Algeria sort of evolved this whole series of legal codes, and it was this category of exception on which the state, the Algérie française was really built. So I had that rolling around in my head, and I could not read Agamben without thinking, like, what about what about the sort of colonial ghosting of this term? What about that? And he nowhere thinks through that in the text. And I just found that incredibly troubling. And so what does that mean for a theory of testimony if you're leaving the immense scope of European colonial violence outside of the frame? So that was the spark point. And I sort of write or think through a colonial genealogy of this term, both in the essay, well, not really in the essay. The essay that I wrote was just a critique of this point. But in the book chapter, I tried to open this up. And what would it be to think about testimony otherwise, from a perspective that thinks about this kind of exclusion and abjection from the perspective of colonized space. And it's like no other philosopher or writer put this together, the sort of colonial resonance of that term, except the novelist Zahia Rahmani. She has this book called Musulman Roman, Muslim, a novel. And so when I read that book, I saw literary space, and this literary text is actually thinking through this history in a way that I'm trying to as well, right? So that's where I went with that.
Okay. Amazing.
And so there we go. And kind of cleared some space. That's why it's the first chapter too. Kind of cleared some space for thinking about testimony in different ways.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna put you on the spot for a second because you've mentioned a bunch of the writers. So here are 6 of the writers that are featured. Can I ask you to recommend anything's off the top of your head? You've already mentioned a few novels from at least 4 of them so far.
Yes.
But anything that comes off. So for a listener who does not know any Algerian literature or doesn't think they know any Algerian literature, what are some things that you gotta read?
So the question comes right up immediately of translation, right? So this is sort of always working with the issues of translation. So for readers of French, I can go right to the novels. Only a few of these have been translated to English yet. But I mean, Yamina Meshakra, the person who's front and center here, her work has not been translated or published in English. It is absolutely incandescent. She has a novel called La Grotte Éclatée, The Exploded Cave, which it sort of narrates from the perspective of a woman who has joined the resistance in, I think the screen just froze. Okay, who's joined the resistance. It sort of narrates the Revolutionary War from this incredible perspective. And the prose is luminous and transformative and strange and brilliant. And she was a close friend of Kateb Yassin and is often sort of connected to him, but just it's absolutely, this book changed my life. So, I mean, I would start there for French readers. It's not widely available. I do everything I can to put it in people's hands. I'm often teaching it. Zahir Rahmani has a trilogy of novels, 2 of which have been published in English translation, right? So they are Mots Musulmans Romans and Frantz Récit d'Enfance, I think. So the last 2, Muslim, a novel, and France, I forget how the title appears in English. In any case, also incredible, very different style. Jebar, I mean, I would teach you, I would just like want to sit people down and go through her entire oeuvre, but a great starting point. She has a collection of short fiction called Women of Algiers in Their Apartment, which is the title of a Delacroix painting of sort of, you know, women in a so-called harem in Algiers in the 19th century. But so she reworks that in a title story called Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement, and Women of Algiers in Their Apartment. And it's challenging and opaque and absolutely beautifully constructed and sort of musically constructed. She was listening to a lot of music and sort of spending a lot of time with women in and around Algiers when she wrote it. So that's a good entry point to Assia Jebar's work. Shall I continue?
Sure. If there are any final ones, then yeah, sure.
Well, you can read Samira Nagrouche is sort of one of the most extraordinary living poets in Algeria right now. And she actually is a friend. I met her when I was doing my dissertation research, and we just sort of connected about other things. And she was helping me sort of figure out how to meet people in Algiers. And then I also started reading her work. And she has something called 7 Little Jasmine Monologues. That's the translated version. And it's a series of 7 verses. Each one has the name of a different city, and each city has experienced sort of revolution and uprising in the last 10 years. And it ends with Algiers. And that's, I think, is sort of a really extraordinary place to begin reading Nagrouche's work, which is also immense. Her oeuvre is immense and growing.
Okay. I want to ask you, before we move on to some of the other projects, what your relationship with Fanon's work, let me say it differently, how your relationship with his work has sort of changed over the last 15 years of you diving into this project?
Oh, that is I love that question as a relationship, because it really has been, you know, I remember I actually first encountered The Wretched of the Earth in English translation when I was 19 years old, sort of still an undergraduate, and sort of puzzled. I just saw it on a library bookshelf, and I just sort of tried to puzzle through it, but I had so little context at that point for really understanding it, but it just felt like something I wanted to read. And I, heard about it. And I think it was, I read it again in the first year of graduate school in French, right? Les Dames de la Terre. And started to really, piece through it and puzzle through it, and to actually feel the difference reading not in translation, because the translations of Fanon have really, in some sense, transformed Fanon into a different kind of thinker and different kind of writer, which is a whole afterlife. But my second year of graduate school, I think, I actually started to get really interested in some of his I started to read his other works and just to think about his time as a soldier in Algeria, then his time working as at the psychiatric hospital in Algeria, and reading some of his shorter pieces and letters, and then just rethinking his work from the perspective of its poetics, and Fanon as a kind of like an incredible writer. And so the first time I ever spoke at an academic conference was actually, I had written a piece on some of Fanon's writings, but his friendship with Sartre and de Beauvoir. And I just remember being so sort of nervous, but also I went to this conference and his daughter was literally sitting right in front of me, Mireille Fanon. And I just felt this sort of, I don't know, we had this whole conversation and she sort of pointed out a number of things to me. So it felt personal, I guess, from the start. And then I just have continued to read and teach with and think with Fanon. I just think he's an incredibly prescient and phenomenological sort of descriptive writer. And I yeah, I don't, it's an ongoing evolution basically, but I turned to his work over and over again.
Amazing. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about Signs in the Desert. What's this book about?
This is a book that sort of, it emerged out of the seams of the last book, and has some sense taken over. So I'm working on this right now. And where do I start? In some sense, it takes on the very profoundly colonial idea that the desert is empty space, and sort of a space that, in the Sahara in particular, colonial cartographies of the continent, and we sort of, it's like this empty zone that divides the Maghreb and North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa in these configurations, and a space that's sort of usefully blurry for all kinds of things to happen. So it started to think about this very idea that the Sahara was empty, because when I was a graduate student, someone took me with them on a trip to Ain Sefra in sort of the edge of the desert in Algeria. And I was stunned to actually hear people talking about and to learn about the fact that the French had detonated 13 nuclear bombs in the Sahara between 1960 and 66. And I found it really just unsettling and kind of embarrassing that I didn't know this as someone who'd been studying Algeria, studying the sort of period of the decolonizing war. And the very fact that first of all, could have happened, but also been just sort of effaced from sort of most people's knowledge, including my own, I found shocking. So I just started to investigate the bombs, actually. That's where it started. And what you're looking at there is a picture of, this is a French military map from the 1960s of the mountain called Tawarit Tanafela, which is in the deep south in Algeria. And those 13 points are the points where they detonated 13 nuclear bombs between 60 and 66. Right, so I just think like those bombs were the starting point. They left a toxic legacy whose effects are not in the past. I mean, this is an ongoing problem. People are living with this toxicity even now. And it really brought to my awareness, like I had been saying, we need to rethink the sort of decolonial timelines. There's not just like colonization and then post-colonial, like the violence of colonial occupation endures. And here it is just totally literalized, right? The toxicity of French occupation it's in the soil, it's in people's lives, it's in people's lungs, it's in people's DNA. And it is a story that has been sort of blanked out of historiography. There are a number of people now starting to work on it, including myself. And so that's the starting point. The book itself is a work in progress. I'm writing it this year. But each chapter sort of investigates and pushes back on the idea that the desert is empty, because that very idea was sort of at the heart of the colonial project. And it then, after independence of all of the countries in North Africa and West Africa, it was sort of the idea that like the desert itself being empty sort of facilitated all kinds of extraction projects and there's uranium mines and phosphate mining and nuclear testing that was ongoing. So I sort of lay out that history and then look at aesthetic works that help to expose and make visible or make palpable the effects of those histories, if that makes sense.
That is absolutely crazy. I had never heard anything about this, these 17 nuclear bombs. I had never heard anything about this.
I am not surprised. I often start when I talk about this, there are like in the news just last year, there's like this red dust from the Sahara that falls in Europe, right? Every once in a while. And there were these photographs of the red dust falling in Jura in the mountains in France. And the scientists were like, oh, it's radioactive, right? So there's radioactive dust falling in Europe, sort of the return of the colonial repressed. And if you ask people like, why is it radioactive? And there's this incredible, and that's why, because of this history. Before the French moved their stuff to the islands in the South Pacific, they were bombing in the Algerian Sahara.
Jill, but radioactive dust in civilized countries is unacceptable.
That's exactly the point, right? People start to notice it when it's
how uncivilized.
Yes. But imagine, I mean, out there in the desert sand right now, literally are like the
Yeah.
French just buried all of the toxic waste. It's all out there, right? So just imagine the consequences of that.
Crazy. Okay, speaking of desert, tell me about Desert Futures. What is the Desert Futures Collective?
Oh, thank you for asking. If you see there, you can see the poster also behind me.
Yeah.
So originally this conference was supposed to happen in 2020, and we all know what happened in March 2020. So it's actually happening this month now. But the Desert Futures Collective, so you heard what I was just saying about the idea of the deserts is empty, and if we start to rethink that and put the desert at the center of our thinking, of our understanding of history, of African history, of Maghrebi history, and European history too, pictures radically change, right? So much about our assumptions have to radically change. And if we start to think about the desert as inherently full of life, and itself living, things also have to radically change. So I'm not thinking that alone. When I was in graduate school, I made friends with a couple of people who were also thinking about this, but in different contexts. And one is Francisco Robles, who's now at Notre Dame, who sort of a Latinx studies scholar, but really thinks about the Sonoran Desert as sort of, a border zone of the US and as a site for US imperialism. And I was thinking about the Sahara because I had just been in Algeria and sort of learning about these nuclear bombs. And I have a friend who I've mentioned already, Ibrahim Al-Gabli, who's now faculty at Williams College. And he was also thinking about this. What happens if we start to center the Sahara? So we started these conversations in graduate school. And then once we got jobs, we were like, well, let's use the resources and the things around us to start building a thing. So it started off with 3 of us, and then we started to talk to other people. And sort of what happens when you think about the aesthetics and politics of desert spaces together, and the Sahara in particular. And it started to grow. And so a couple of other people, for me, is Samia Henny, who's an architectural historian working on the toxic sites in Algeria. In particular, there's an historian named Roxanne Panchesi, who's also been thinking through sort of the cultural and aesthetic traces of the French bombs in particular, right? But we just started to grow, basically talking to people. And we organized a series of 3 conferences for 2020 with the idea that this would be just a space to create conversations and to think seriously with scholars, artists, and filmmakers and other people together. We had to postpone the conferences, so they've now happened, except for the one that's happening at the end of this month. And we're probably 40 or 50 people now involved in some way and planning different publications, but just really rethinking, like, what happens if we start to center the desert as the focus and not the periphery of our thought, and also completely undermine this idea that desert, I mean, the very word desert actually performs a kind of colonizing function, because in English or in French or in Spanish, it empties, right? It makes deserted. And in the languages of people who actually live in these places, there are many other ways to talk about this space, right? So we're just like sort of just trying to intrinsically undermine the very idea that deserts are empty, and also the point of it being futures, right? To think about the desert not as a space of apocalypse and catastrophe and a place with no history, but a place with history and also profoundly important to all of our futures, actually. So that's cool. The gist of it. It's a whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about before we move on to the quick Q&A.
Yeah.
I'm curious how your work has been received in Algeria, and what is that sort of that conversation like?
That is a really good question, because I just published this book this year, and I, for the last 5 years, have not been able to get a visa to go to Algeria, because the government regularly denies visas. So I'm trying to get a visa right now, actually, to return and to have these conversations in person again. So that is actually yet to be known, quite honestly. I mean, so the extent of the effect of my work in Algeria is really through interpersonal communication and conversations and the networks and intellectual friendships that I maintain with people, right? So TBD, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm
So,
really curious
like, so my
to.
work hasn't been translated into French at this point. So,
Mhm.
but so that's something that I'm hopeful about. So Samira Nagrouche, the poet I mentioned, she's actually translating the article that I wrote about her work into French, and the sort of, so that those sorts of connections can grow. And I'd love to be more closely in conversation with people in Algeria,
Yeah,
which is the whole point of trying to return so that I can talk
sure.
to people.
Cool. Okay, let's do some of these quick questions, and then maybe there'll be some questions from the chat as well.
Oh,
So what are you reading or watching right now?
quite honestly, so this is the last month of spring semester, and what I'm reading a lot of are PhD dissertations and undergraduate theses and papers. But I'm also deeply into, there's this long poem called by a Tuareg poet named Hawad, called Sahara, Vision Atomique, right? So Sahara, Atomic Visions. And I've read it a few times, and it's like a spark sort of happens when I read a text. I'm like, oh, there's something here, like I want to work with this. So I've been rereading it maybe for the third time slowly. It's a book-length poem, but it started off as an oral piece in Tamashek, and he then translated it into French with his partner who's French. And it is this absolutely incandescent, incantatory sort of like exorcism almost through poetry of the toxicity of like 100 years basically of invasion and occupation of the desert, like his particular sort of area where his Tuareg community is from, but also actually charts out and thinks through and pushes back on the violence of those bombs and the way that they've affected and continue to affect the Tuareg. So I've just been so deeply into that actually when I'm not reading student work. I'm obsessed with
Cool.
a number of other things, but that's what first comes to mind.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh, I was thinking about Yamina Mashakra, the writer I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
She happened to die 2 weeks before I first went to Algeria. And I feel like it's almost like I was almost shadowing her. Like I kept meeting people who knew her. I met her mentor. She worked in the psychiatric hospital there. She was a psychiatrist as well as a writer. And somebody took me and I sat in her chair. And I just felt I just wished I could have known her. So I would love for that to be possible. I've just spent so much time with her work that I would just love to be able to talk to her.
Okay, so what do people most misunderstand about your work?
I mean, I don't feel super misunderstood, but I think it's interesting. There's a kind of tension that's like, I work in a French department that I'm perpetually encountering, like assumptions about what it is that I must do, therefore, because I do nothing that has to do with France. Like none of my work is actually located in France or centered by France at all. Like it's really oriented by like thinking like grounded in Algeria, frankly, just because that's where my path has taken me. So that's one thing. Like I'm a French professor of not French. And the other is just the interesting sense of like, where is the Maghreb? What is that? And that's something that I'm always thinking through or trying to explain to people, because it has this just really interesting history. It's like, and it sort of challenges a lot of geopolitical cartographies, right? Is it the Middle East? Is it Africa? What's the relationship to Europe? And the very invention, there's a really great book actually called The Invention of the Maghreb by what is his name? Abdelmajid Hanoum. It just came out, but just really thinking through that. So like those basic things, like I work in a French department on the Maghreb, but like, what does that really mean?
Yeah. Okay. And lastly, maybe this is whose work do you admire or are inspired by? I'm going to change this slightly because you probably have a long list of folks who are colleagues and stuff like that. I'm curious, outside of your field entirely, outside of your profession, like, are there like random musicians who inspire you, or you deeply admire, or are there people that are sort of like off the beaten path that you're like, oh my God, yeah, this person, I weirdly have like a nerd crush on them, or
I mean, there are so many. I don't know, like I love Toni Morrison. I mean, right?
sure.
Like, and just the works that I can just, I don't know, just change my way of being.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see if there's any questions from the chat. If not, I have another question for you.
Okay, all right.
My question is, what did you deeply misunderstand about Algeria in the first half of sort of thinking about your work? Like as you started thinking about, oh, I think I really like this stuff, I want to like write about Algeria. What did you like deeply misunderstand until you went there?
Oh, that is a really good question. I'm trying to think back to what, I mean, it just was such a, in some sense, just a blank slate. I had just such very little, such very little to go on except a few writers. But I mean, so I had, you know, of course, like one of the first contexts besides Assia Djebar's work that I had was the Battle of Algiers, right? The film, Ponte Corvo's film, The Battle of Algiers, right? And I don't know. And I remember showing up at Algiers and it just felt like so unknown, except like there were these like familiar, you know, like the streets of Algiers look like they look in the film, a number of them still. But it just felt like it was a gradual process of getting out of that sort of idealized vision or that sort of fixed vision of the past, the revolutionary past that I had from contact with that film. And just like really get also just like that Algiers is such a small part of Algeria, right? How truly vast and complex Algeria is, I think was something I didn't really appreciate until spending some time being there and traveling outside of the capital city. So I guess like, I think I had a Algiers centric impression of Algeria. Yeah. And that's like moving into the desert spaces, I think has also disabused me of that.
Yeah. I want to ask another question about the sort of limitations. So, you know, you talk about the disruptive and surreptitious power of literature. And I'm sort of curious about the limitations of literature to enable us to decolonize our memory and decolonize our imagination of the future. What do you think are some of the limitations of literature?
I mean, I think there's a limitation if people start to think that like decolonizing our minds is enough, right? Or that just thinking about decolonizing is somehow enough. And I'm kind of like, literature is humble in a way. It can't actually do anything. So literary works actually like exert a kind of power on our imaginations, but it has to be in connection to with then how, you know, our habitus and our comportment in our lives. And I'm thinking a lot about an essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. That's really pushed, you know, like decolonization is really about land and sovereignty and who has been dispossessed and who continues to be dispossessed, you know, right now, as we sit here talking about decolonizing, right? So like, it's something profoundly important about recognizing that, and like the temporality of decolonization is not over. It has not happened. That's the point of the future, right? We live in a world that is so profoundly structured and shaped by colonizing violence that is ongoing. So if literature can do anything, it just can help us to see that and to learn to see those blind spots and to start to recognize like my very institution, the land I'm on, and how these things are connected. So that's it. So there's a limitation in the sense of if we start to just like contain literature to an aesthetic sort of bubble, or think about decolonizing as something that's happened or that's not like imminently crucial, and that people's lives, not just people's lives, like non-human lives are also at stake right now. That's the risk. But that's what I'm trying to push toward, thinking about futurity.
Yeah. How do you manage people co-opting this term and sort of cheapening the idea of decolonization and turning it into sort of a gimmick and a brand?
I mean, that's the work, is to push back on that happening, I think. And I think it's true. And I got into this problem by giving my own book the title, with the word.
Sure, of course.
But it is a direct sort of reference to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. And it's also thinking through a whole sort of body of scholarship on Algerian decolonization in particular. Right. So for me, it has a very grounded sense, histories of decolonization in Algeria. But I do think it's a real problem when we start, and this is, again, the essay, Decolonization is not a metaphor. It's like, it's not a synonym for social justice. It's not a synonym for diversifying your syllabus, right? It has, real stakes in land rights and sovereignty.
Sure.
So I don't know, just like continually talking about that. And I open all of my courses, I have to make people read that essay and we think about it.
Cool. Well, Jill, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for taking some time to speak with us. I really, really appreciate that.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Mikey. Also, I really appreciated your opening comments about kindness and I really, and curiosity and openness, because I really think that's at the heart of it, or just even my own approach to scholarship. I think it should be about kindness and listening. And I wanted to thank you for
Thanks. Yeah, we take our core values really, really seriously. They're not just words on a website. We think through them very intentionally. So thanks so much.
I can feel that. So thank you very much. And to everyone who was here.
Yeah. So this will go up on YouTube and on our podcast tomorrow. So if you know anyone who would have loved to watch it, please share widely. And we'll be back next week. This is the last event for this week.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.